a second.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of Pride of Baltimore 2's Deeper Dive virtual lecture series. My name is Jeff Crosby. I'm on the ship operations side of Pride of Baltimore, Inc. Behind the scenes is Patrick Smith, and the man of the hour is Tim Grove, and I'll do a little more thorough introduction a little bit later. For those of you that are new, a little background on what Deeper Dive is. It's a virtual lecture series every Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. And the purpose of this series is to take a bit of a deeper dive than we traditionally do in our interpretation regarding privateers, tall ships, and the Chesapeake Bay. And this series will introduce you to often untold stories of survivors, African Americans, Indigenous people, women, and others. Coming up, the future of this webinar schedule, if you're interested, on Thursday, March 3rd, we'll have Kate Marks, who's going to be talking about the women of the War of 1812. Thursday, March 10th, Jeff Bolster is going to be talking about his book, Black Jacks. And Thursday, March 17th, a living legacy and overview of Piscataway history with Mario Harley. So if you want to register for those lectures, head over to our website, pride2.org, and there's links in the Come Aboard section to be able to register for those. And if you wanted to check out the previous 2 lecture series, they're on our YouTube channel. Just search Pride of Baltimore 2 on YouTube, and that's the number 2, not the Roman numeral 2. A huge thank you to the Maryland Humanities Council that provided the funding to make this possible. You can check out their programs and special events and learn more about the Maryland Humanities Council by visiting marylandhumanities.org. And I want to thank the Maryland Humanities Council staff, Marilyn Hotza, Lindsay Baker, Maya Moretta, and Sarah Wiseman. Following Tim's presentation, we will be taking questions via the Q&A chat. It's at the very bottom of your screen. And we ask that you hold your questions until after the presentation. It's a little bit easier to manage. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. But if you have some questions left over, or if you have some questions that creep up over the next couple of days, feel free to shoot us an email at pride@pride2.org. And a bit of introduction to Tim Grove. Tim Grove, with his book Star-Spangled, set out to go beyond Francis Scott Key and to provide a deeper context of an iconic American story by including women's history, African American history, and maritime history. He answers the question, why Baltimore? By introducing readers to shipbuilder Thomas Kemp. Learn something new about the Star-Spangled Banner, flag, and song, and hear a preview of Tim's upcoming book about the Siege of Yorktown, which sounds pretty cool. And that's the last major conflict of the American Revolution. Tim Grove believes the past is filled with amazing stories waiting to be told. He writes from 25 years of experience as a public historian and a museum professional, working at some of America's most visited history museums. His career memoir, A Grizzly in the Mail and Other Adventures in American History, highlights some of the fun projects he's worked on. More recently, he has been writing history-focused nonfiction books for ages 10 through 14. His book, First Flight Around the World, was a finalist for the 2016 YLSAA Excellence in Nonfiction Award. Besides telling stories from a different perspective, he seeks to help all ages understand the historical process and to see that the past is vitally relevant to our world today. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to Pride of Baltimore for inviting me to be part of this series. I'm a huge fan of the ship, and one of my biggest dreams is to do a book talk from the deck of the ship. So hopefully that will come true someday. Unfortunately, it didn't happen in 2020, which it was supposed to, but everything didn't happen in 2020, right? So anyway, so I wrote this book when I say, can you see, most people can finish the line. They know what goes next, most Americans, I should say. We've been hearing this song a lot during the Olympics. Every time an American gets gold, they managed to play it on TV. And so there you can see a very early edition of the Star-Spangled Banner. I think this was printed in Baltimore. And so what I want to do today is I'm not going to go into detail about the Battle of Baltimore or Francis Scott Key, really. I want to talk broadly about different things that surprised me in researching this book. And I will say that the target age for this book is ages 10 to 14, so it's young readers. But I also find that a lot of adults like my books as well. This was my third book for young readers. I have written history books for adults as well. So yeah, that's good. Next slide. So here's a quiz to start out the talk. When did the Star-Spangled Banner become the US national anthem? There's 4 options there: Civil War, 1917, 1918, or 1931. Give you a minute to choose which one. And then next slide. So 1931 is the answer. And let me tell you what the other dates mean. During the Civil War, it was the song was the unofficial anthem of the North. In 1917, by 1917, the Army and Navy had made it their official national anthem for all military ceremonies. And then in 1918 is the first documented performance of it at a sporting event for the first game of the World Series between the Chicago Cubs and the Boston Red Sox. And by the 1940s, I believe it was standard to hear it played before a baseball game. And 1931, of course, is the answer. It took decades for Congress to decide this song will become our national anthem, but President Herbert Hoover signed it, and so signed the bill that made it our national anthem in 1931. So next slide. The US national anthem is rare among world anthems. If you start looking at the different topics that anthems are about, it's sometimes a prayer for the sovereign, an ode to the character of the people of a certain nation. The funny thing, I think, is that ours is about a historic event that most Americans don't know much about. And so my goal with this book was to add more context, tell the broader story of the Star-Spangled Banner. And why did I decide to tell this story? Well, I had the unique privilege of working at the National Museum of American History, one of the Smithsonian museums in Washington, owner of the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, owned by the American people. But I was there during a $10 million conservation project to preserve the flag for future generations, and got to work on various projects related to the flag, doing some initial research, and realized how rich the story is. And so that's kind of what initially prompted me to think about this book, because there are so many things, like I said before, that Americans just don't know about the story. If they know anything, they will link Francis Scott Key's name with the story, but that's about it. So I decided to focus on 6 characters. 3 are civilians and 3 are military people. And one of the things I realize is that we don't often hear the British perspective of this story. And so 2 of my characters are British military officers. One of the civilians is female, and one of the civilians is not pictured here because we don't know what he looked like. Thomas Kemp, the shipbuilder, who I'm guessing some of the audience out there is familiar with Thomas Kemp. A shipbuilder who had a large shipbuilding shipyard in Fells Point, Baltimore. So I've titled this talk 15 Facts You Don't Know About the Star-Spangled Banner. Why 15? Well, 15 because there were 15 stars and 15 stripes on the Star-Spangled Banner flag. So that's where we get 15. So number one is maybe a basic point for many of you if you have studied the topic at all, but the song is about a battle in 1814 during the War of 1812, which lasted from 1812 to 1815. Talk about confusing for students. I'm not really sure why it's called the War of 1812 when it spanned almost 3 years, but that's what it is called. And so first thing is, it happened in 1814 in September in Baltimore, the event that it's about. So number two, the British hated Baltimore. It was then America's third largest city, about 50,000 or so residents. One British publication called Baltimore a nest of pirates. And that was for good reason, because one thing I think that gets lost for most people, if they know that the Star-Spangled Banner is about an attack on Baltimore, they don't know why. Why would the British want to attack Baltimore? Well, the main reason, of course, is the privateering industry. Government sanctioned pirates. They weren't pirates because they were sanctioned by the government, but the ships sailing out, like this ship, you recognize this image right here. That's the Pride, of course. But Thomas Kemp is a character that was responsible for some of the privateering industry. In fact, his shipyard was booming in Fells Point, and he built 4 of the most celebrated privateers. And one of them was the Chasseur, and the Pride of Baltimore is based, I think, loosely on the Chasseur. So here you can see a ship certificate. Each ship that was built, the shipbuilder had to file the certificate. It says the name of the ship, where it was built, who the owner was. And so this one is for the Comet, and I think it's from 1810. It was built for Thorndike Chase, is the owner's name. So built by Thomas Kemp. There you can see his signature there. So it was kind of like a birth certificate, kind of, for a ship. But every privateering vessel had that. They also had to have a letter of marque. And so research, a lot of these documents are in the National Archives today, so you can look up this. I think this particular document on the left is in the National Archives. There you can see a picture of a shipyard that would have been a common sight in Baltimore. Number 3, British Rear Admiral George Coburn he's kind of the villain of this story, and most people have not heard of him, but he terrorized the Chesapeake Bay for about a year. He arrived in March 1813. So the battle was September 1814. So he arrived about a year before. And let me just read how American papers described him. First of all, he said, so he arrived in March of 1813, and only 10 days after entering the Chesapeake Bay, he had boasted to his superior that I have no hesitation in pronouncing that the whole of the shores and towns within this vast bay, not excepting the capital itself, will be wholly at your mercy or destroyed at your pleasure. So he was ready to damage morale, which was his task, was to damage American morale. And so he sailed around the Chesapeake Bay, attacking places like St. Michael's, Havre de Grace. He has a legacy today for sure. If you look at local history, he caused a lot of damage. I have some great quotes here from the book. American newspapers called him the Great Bandit, and the Boston Gazette wrote, "There breathes not in any quarter of the globe a more savage monster than Coburn. He is a disgrace to England and to human nature." And then the Niles Weekly Register said, "This Coburn is one of the vilest creatures in existence." So you have some superb hyperbole there, but they didn't like this guy. So number 4 is another character that is one of my 6 main characters, and this gets at the women's history perspective. Businesswoman Mary Pickers Gil is the woman who sewed the flag. In fact, 2 flags. She was born in Philadelphia in 1776, but her mother was a very active flag maker. Her mother her name was Rebecca Young, and she was a very active flag maker in Philadelphia. So no doubt, it being a small community of seamstresses in Philadelphia, no doubt they knew each other. She knew Betsy Ross, the competition, of course. And that's one reason I would say I wrote the book, is because I get tired of hearing people say that Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag. There's no documentation for that. Historians cannot find any evidence that says that indeed is fact. And so most Americans associate the flag with Betsy Ross, but I would like to say that Mary Pickers Gil is a name I wish more Americans knew. So yeah, so this is a picture of her house on the left. It's on Albemarle Street in Baltimore, and it's open today. It's preserved as a museum. I'm guessing some of you may have been there. You can see the rooms, and the front room where the main business area. And there you can see on the right a listing for of residents of Baltimore, and there you can see her name there, about 6 down, maker of ship's colors, signals. She was in the perfect location because she was very near to Fells Point, which is where all the shipyards were, but she was also selling colors to the military. And so those were her 2 main sources of business: maritime enterprise and the military. So she sewed at least 2 flags for Fort McHenry that historians can document. One was called a storm flag. It was smaller to fly during bad weather and a military engagement. And the larger one was to fly during most other times. It was called a garrison flag, and it's the large one we kind of associate with Fort McHenry today, the huge one. And the one that we call the Star-Spangled Banner was the garrison flag size. And this is one of the coolest documents, I think. This is the receipt for the Star-Spangled Banner. It was the members of the military from Fort McHenry went to visit Mary Pickers Gil and request this order. And so this is, since it was a government record, it's that's maybe why we have it. I'm not sure why it still exists, but it's actually owned by the Flag House in Baltimore. And so they usually have it on display, I think, in their museum there. So the Star-Spangled Banner, the garrison flag that I was talking about, was about a quarter the size of a basketball court. It was huge. And I say was because it shrank over the years. There you can see a picture of it with some holes in it. Even one of the stars is missing. In the 19th century, it was common practice to give away mementos. If you have been in contact with a very famous object, you wanted to prove whether it was someone's hair or, in this case, a little piece of the Star-Spangled Banner. So that's why on occasion pieces were cut off. And when they were doing the research and the conservation project surrounding the Star-Spangled Banner, there was a call put out, send us your pieces of the flag if you have some, if you know of some in your archives or your museums. And so the museum did get a few that came back during that project. So the Stars and Stripes, just a little bit about the flag at the time. That's what it looks like, the garrison flag. That's a reproduction in the flag house. Next couple of slides, Patrick. So how many Stars and Stripes were there? Like I said, next 15 stars and stripes. At this time, they were adding stripes for every star that they added, so every new state. So what were the extra 2 states? Anyone know? Go ahead, next slide. They were Vermont and Kentucky, but yes, next slide. There were actually 18 states in 1814. So the flag laws had not caught up with the number of states. And so I can't remember which year it changed, but not long, I think, after this, they decided to limit the number of stripes to 13 to represent 13 original colonies, and then just keep adding stars. So number 8 of my 15 points, what people don't know is the attack on Baltimore occurred shortly after the British had burned the new capital city, Washington, D.C. Some people know that the British, during the War of 1812, attacked Washington, and that was in August, right before the Battle of Baltimore. If you ever get a chance to go into the basement of the White House, you can still see burn traces from when they burned the White House, which is very, very exciting. So take that opportunity if you ever get that chance. Okay, next slide. Number 9, this is British Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane. He was the top man in charge. He was over all the British forces, the Navy forces. And he was based in Bermuda, I believe, but in August of 1814, so that's when the Battle of Baltimore was, or sorry, the Battle of Washington was, the attack on Washington. He had just come in from Bermuda, and so Coburn, the bandit, reported to this guy, and as the man in charge, he was quite proud of the attack on Washington and the success of it. And after the Battle of Washington, he had determined that he hated the heat. He was from Scotland, and it was quite sticky, as we know it gets in the Chesapeake region in August. And so he was ready to head for Rhode Island and come back to Baltimore and attack Baltimore in November of 1814. But his top admiral and his top army general were trying to convince him to attack Baltimore. And suddenly the weather changed and the tides changed, and he had to wait. They would have to wait a week or two to get outside, to leave the Chesapeake Bay, the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, because of weather conditions. And so he decided to use that time and suddenly turned around and decided to attack Baltimore. Next slide. So Francis Scott Key, of course, this is when he enters the story. He was a Georgetown lawyer. He ended up with a front row seat to the attack. This is not where he planned to be. He was requested to go on a truce ship out to help negotiate for the British to free a friend, a Dr. Beans, who they had captured during the attack on Washington. And so he went out to lend his oratory skills, his persuasive skills, and which was not needed because the decision had already pretty much been made that they were going to free Dr. Beans. But because they had been guests of the British officers during a midday meal, which was customary, he had heard a lot of the planning for the attack on Baltimore. And so when he and his companion asked if they could leave, they said, absolutely not. You heard too much. You're our prisoner. Unfortunately, you have to watch the battle unfold until everything is over. And so that's how he ended up with a front row seat. Next slide. One of the minutiae, well, it's not minutiae to some people, but the question is, when he was watching the battle unfold and he ended up being inspired to write the lyrics, the words to what became our national anthem, was he writing lyrics or was he writing a poem? He did have a song in mind, a tune in mind. There were about 85 other songs written to the same tune, including one of the most popular political tunes of the day. And so, was he writing a poem or lyrics? He had written poetry in the past. And so that's a debate that still continues. Number 12 is there is an American flag on display in Gloucester Cathedral in England in honor of the man from Gloucester, an organist who wrote the tune. I was there a couple years ago in this cathedral and was surprised to see an American flag, and I assumed it was World War II related, but it was honoring this man who wrote the tune. So that's kind of interesting. And by the way, it is, and I go into this in the book, but it's not a drinking song as some people think. It was the club song of one of the British men's club, and so it was not the drinking song where people were sitting around in a bar singing this tune. That wasn't the case. Next slide, please. Number 13, a little bit about the battle. It was a two-pronged attack by land and by sea. Often people know more about the attack on Fort McHenry, which was the water attack. But during the land attack, a well-liked British general named Robert Ross was killed during the battle. And one of the mysteries surrounding the Battle of Baltimore is that no one really knows who shot him. Of course, plenty of people tried to take credit, but to this day, we don't know who shot him. Next slide. Rockets Redglare. This is a rocket. It's in the collection of the National Museum of American History in Washington. This is what they looked like. They were on a long pole, which gave them some stability. They were called Congreve Rockets. We sing about Rockets Redglare. It was a brand new technology that most Americans had not seen before. The rockets made a lot of noise and light, but they rarely hit their target. So very quickly, the American soldiers learned they didn't have to worry about the rockets. So next slide. This is one of my favorite documents. It's a ship log. If you look very carefully, it's a British ship log for the HMS Erebus, which was the lone rocket ship in the fleet, the British fleet that attacked Baltimore. And if you look carefully, it says on September 13th that they weighed anchor and commenced firing on the fort, and it mentions the rocket ship and the bombs. And so this is a major primary source from the British perspective. Next slide. Number 15, the last point I want to make is, like I said, with Mary Pickersgill, I tried to add some women's history, and with Thomas Kemp, who was the shipbuilder responsible for a lot of privateer vessels that went after British shipping, that was maritime history. But I also wanted to include African American history, and unfortunately, because it's nonfiction and nonfiction is based on available evidence, I could not make one of the main characters African American because I couldn't find enough historical evidence to draw from. But I did learn the story of the Colonial Marines, and I had not known much about them in before I started the book. The British recruited formerly enslaved men and formed a fighting group that they called the Colonial Marines. The Colonial Marines fought at Washington and Baltimore, and they were not only in this area. There were several groups of Colonial Marines in other parts of the United States, and they did fight for the British in Washington and Baltimore, and I think several died, I think, at Baltimore, at least one. And after the war, they ended up living on the island of Trinidad and were referred to themselves as Americans. You can look that up. It's a very interesting story. But they trained on Tangier Island. If you've been to Tangier Island in the Chesapeake, there are a few historic markers that tell their story. And the fort that used to be there, which the site of the fort is no longer, I think it's underwater now, under the water of the Chesapeake. But it's the story of African Americans and the battle of, or the War of 1812 is interesting because in the Chesapeake region, there were enslaved people even that were fighting for the Americans and for the British, so both sides. And so it's very interesting. Next slide, please. A proclamation that was made by Alexander Cochrane, the head guy, second day of April 1814. Basically what it said was that the British welcomed any enslaved people who wanted to come to their side and wanted to gain freedom. And so all during the time that the British were in the Chesapeake region, you had a lot of enslaved people escaping and coming to the British in hopes that they would, the British would keep their word and give them freedom. So a lot of them were at Tangier Island. Only the younger, strong ones were recruited to fight in the Colonial Marines, but families came and lots of different ages of people came. And the British did keep their word at the end and did evacuate a lot of them to, some went to Bermuda, some to Nova Scotia, and some to Trinidad, like I said. So to British colonies elsewhere. Next slide. This is a bonus here. I found it very interesting that one future American president fought in the Battle of Baltimore, James Buchanan from Pennsylvania. He was president number 15 right before Lincoln, and he was serving as a private in the Pennsylvania militia. So it's kind of a fun fact. Next slide. So when I talk about the Star-Spangled Banner, I don't mean obviously just the national anthem, I mean the flag. And like I said before, the flag has survived for over 200 years and is owned by the American people and on permanent display in the Smithsonian. Today, you can go see a great exhibit. The rocket is there as well. As far as the storm flag is concerned, we don't know what happened. No one knows what happened to the storm flag that Mary Pickersgill sewed. Next slide. So various, all of the main characters are buried in this area. You can see Key's grave in Frederick, Maryland. Certainly he died before his poem became the national anthem. So he had no idea that a song that he just wrote, that he penned, would become the national anthem. Next slide, please. One thing I'd like to encourage my readers to do is to visit the places where history happened. And this area, of course, is rich in sites connected to the Star-Spangled Banner story. There's an address at the top of this slide of an article. I wrote 4 articles around this book, and this one was an article for a day trip and sites you could see in Baltimore related to the battle. And so that's the address for that article. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit about this book, Star-Spangled. I'm going to take 5 minutes or so and read an excerpt from it. If that's okay. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to read a brief excerpt from the book. American Major General Samuel Smith had wisely stationed lookouts along the Chesapeake who gave regular reports and would send immediate notification if the British Armada was sighted. Every day, Major William Barney climbed the 149 steps of the steep spiral staircase to the top of the great wooden dome of the State House in Annapolis. He peered through his telescope and scanned the horizon. Day after day, his report read, "There is nothing in sight." This is the Capitol building in Annapolis. But suddenly, next slide. But suddenly, on September 10th, white sails appeared. Noon, 6 or 7, sail below Plum Point. 1:30 p.m., 12 ships in sight. 4 p.m., 31 ships. They kept coming. By 3 p.m., he counted 50 total. The British were on the move. Throughout the day, Barney had been sending express riders directly to Sam Smith with the most up-to-date intelligence. Smith was fairly certain that a British land attack would begin at North Point, the tip of a peninsula formed where the Back and Patapsco rivers met and flowed into the Chesapeake Bay. The location was 15 miles by road to Baltimore, 10 by sea, and safely out of range of Fort McHenry's guns. Fortunately, a lookout had been posted at North Point for the past several years to track enemy ship movement. The Ridgely House, a brick building with the tall cupola, sat on the point overlooking the broad expanse of the Chesapeake. It was perfectly situated to allow the lookout to observe activity approaching Baltimore. On Sunday morning, September 11th, shortly after noon, a dreaded white flag appeared over the Ridgely House cupola, signaling that British ships were coming up the bay toward Baltimore. Lookouts on Federal Hill in the city were always watching. Federal Hill overlooked Baltimore Harbor and served as a flag signal station to notify the city's citizens of ship arrivals. Observing North Point's white flag, the lookouts went into action. 3 cannon booms pierced the tense air, disrupting worship services in progress across the city. At Wilk Street United Methodist Church, the minister gave a quick benediction. "My brethren and friends, the alarm guns have just fired. The British are approaching, and commending you to God and the word of his grace, I pronounce the benediction, and may the God of battles accompany you." At the Light Street Methodist Church, the Reverend John Gruber took a different approach, saying, "May the Lord bless King George, convert him, and take him to heaven, as we want no more of him." Reverend Kemp at Mary Pickersgill's Church, St. Paul's Episcopal, offered a prayer for protection. "On this memorable day, give us grace to receive a continuance of thy protection and of thy favors." Church bells began ringing, and soldiers ran to grab their guns and report for duty. Streets filled with chaos, people moving in all different directions. Some of the wealthier Baltimoreans fled to their country residences. Those who had family outside the city went to stay with them, but many, like artist Rembrandt Peale, wanted to protect their property in the city and decided to face the attack and endure whatever came. Peale had just opened a new museum, the very first structure in America constructed specifically to display paintings and natural history specimens. If the British came to ransack the city, he hoped the presence of his family of 8 children would dissuade them from damaging his new museum. Unfortunately, historical evidence doesn't tell us what Thomas Kemp and Mary Pickersgill decided to do. So that's obviously leading up to the attack. And so that's a little snippet of what the book sounds like. So if you could go back 3 slides. There we go. So I want to just briefly tell you about my next book coming out, The World Turned Upside Down, coming April 12th. It has a similar format to this book in that I focus on about 5 main characters and how their stories intersect leading up to the siege of Yorktown. The thing that's unique about this book is it's the first time that a nonfiction book for middle grade, which is ages 10 to 14, has been written to include the story of James Lafayette, which is a story that I kind of stumbled upon relatively recently. He was an enslaved man who served as a spy leading up to Yorktown for General Lafayette, who was based in Virginia. And so it's a fascinating story. There's spies involved. There's a big secret. The march of Washington's and French troops from New York area to Virginia had to be a big secret in order to surprise General Cornwallis, who was at Yorktown. And so there's a lot of interesting facts that I dug up related to that march. And so hope you'll check that book out when it's available April 12th. So I'm ready for any questions if people have some questions. Hopefully you do. Hopefully you learned something new.
We actually just got one of our first questions in. So Nancy was wondering, did our country sing any other patriotic national songs before the Star-Spangled Banner?
Yeah, there were several. Battle Hymn of the Republic was certainly one of them, associated with the Civil War. But there were some others.
Can you talk at all about the Congreve Rockets and why they weren't accurate?
So there were several. So sometimes they were fired from ships. In the case of Fort McHenry, the naval assault, they were fired from ships. But they also had a smaller kind of Congreve rocket that was set up on a tripod, and they would use them and carry them for land battles. I think they just hadn't been perfected yet. I think that's why they weren't very accurate. The noise, certainly, from reading different sources, the noise helped to scare the opposing enemy. And the red glare was scary as well. But I think my guess is that they were relieved once they realized that they weren't accurate. So I am not sure how long they were used by the British until new technology came along. So there's an interesting, if you go to the exhibit on the Star-Spangled Banner at the National Museum of American History in Washington, they have a recording of Congreve rockets and different artillery. And I have a friend who worked on that exhibit, and he said there are specialists who know the sounds, and they had gotten their sounds wrong. And when they played it for one of them, they said, "No, you have it wrong." And so they had to go back and record artillery fire. So the Smithsonian is that careful about accuracy, which is a good thing.
Imagine being an expert in artillery. That's incredible. Just the sound of it, I guess. So we have another question in. So are you familiar with any, so they always talk about the land defense of the fort and the Battle of Baltimore. Are you familiar with any American ships involved with the Battle of Baltimore?
I am not. Are you guys? Jeff, do you know anything about that?
I also don't know of, specifically with the Battle of Baltimore, any Baltimore ship maritime engagements. There was a lot of preparation. There was some blockades made by sinking some ships to prevent access of the British Navy vessels, and some engagement on barges and things further up rivers, but nothing serious.
I think it was called Barney's Flotilla, went around the Chesapeake. They were a bunch of American ships, but I think the question was about Battle of Baltimore. So
yeah, my understanding was Oliver Hazard Perry was in Baltimore, at least in the days prior to the battle, and because he was supervising some work on a ship. And I've heard stories. I haven't come across it in a book myself, but my understanding is that Oliver Hazard Perry was like, "I'm getting out of this town. The British are coming. Like all is lost," and he went and gave up the ship again. But
I do know that the ship, the Java, which was a warship under construction for the American Navy, was in Baltimore, and the British, of course, knew that. So that would have been a prize to destroy that. I can't remember if Thomas Kemp was building it. I think he was, but I'm not sure.
Interesting. And then, one of our guests also mentioned the song "Hail Columbia" was a very common patriotic song during the time of the battle. And I think it's cliche, but we all love it. Yankee Doodle, I think, was a pretty popular song at the time as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it was, I'm guessing it was popular during War of 1812, Yankee Doodle.
So if any folks have any other questions, be sure to pop them in the chat.
One thing I wanted to mention about Mary Pickersgill is that she had a daughter named Caroline, who was 13, and so she helped with it. And she had, I think, 3 nieces. She had an indentured servant who was actually an African-American woman named Grace, I believe. And she also owned 1 slave, and she also had a boarder. So all of those people, a male boarder for money, to make money, were living in that tiny house, if you've been there, in Baltimore. I should say, so one thing I also didn't say was that the flag was so big. If you've been to the house, it's a tiny house, and you think, how on earth could they complete such a large project in that house? And the answer is they didn't. They got permission to go to a brewery next door and spread the flag out in the malt house. And Caroline, her daughter, wrote later, the flag being so very large, my mother was obliged to obtain permission from the proprietors of Brown's Brewery, which was in our neighborhood, to spread it out in their malt house. Caroline also wrote that her mother worked many nights and until midnight in order to complete the job in the given time, which was 6 weeks. They had 6 weeks to complete it. Since the light bulb had not been invented, Mary and her helpers relied as much as possible on natural light, but still needed to use candlelight or oil lamps after dark. No doubt the fine stitch work required close lights, so there must have been always a danger of fire near the fabric. I found that very interesting. I do want to mention one other thing about slavery, and that is that I do bring up the topic of slavery. It's very important to talk about who owned slaves when you're talking about this time in history. And I was very shocked to find out that all 4 of my American characters of the 6, so 2 are British, 4 American, even Mary Pickers Gil and Thomas Kemp, who was a Quaker, all of them owned at least 1 slave. And of course, Francis Scott Key is the man who wrote Land of the Free and the Home of the Brave, and he was a slave owner his whole life, I think beginning at age 21 or so. He did free several slaves during his lifetime. He had a very interesting relationship with people of African descent, and I do talk about that a lot in the book. So there's that.
Thank you so much, Tim. We've got one more question for you. Can you talk at all about the bombs that were used by the British and the ships that launched them?
I don't know a lot about the bombs. They were different sizes. I do know that the British, again, didn't do a lot of damage to the fort. The fort held. There was one big direct impact on one of the, was it a magazine, or I think it was a magazine that exploded and killed a bunch of people in the fort. But considering, and I can't remember right now, how the number of bombs that were launched at Fort McHenry is an incredible number. And considering that there weren't more injuries and fatalities, I think is pretty remarkable. And
my understanding is both those bomb ships ended up having a second life as well. Erebus and Terror ended up, being refit and used in Arctic expeditions in the later half of the 19th century, which is kind of wild, going from extreme combat to the Great White North.
Yeah, the ship names are very interesting. Like you said, Terror is one of them, but they all have fun names to inspire terror, I guess, in the enemy. But
yeah, I always liked it. They were Vesuvius class and Terror, and there was another. They all kind of had very ominous names for bringing destruction.
And one of them had just, I think that I think the rocket ship had just arrived in America, and it was brand new to their fleet, and it was top of the, it was like high tech, and it was one of only 4 or 3 in the entire British Navy, and it was in Baltimore. So that would have been exciting in a bad way, probably, for the Americans to see if they could see it in action out in the harbor.
And it definitely brought an element of different, a very interesting element. And I'm going to hit you with one more question, because you're a writer, and I think it's a really cool question. Kind of using your historical fiction kind of lens, do you think Francis Scott Key had any idea that the song would become our national anthem? Do you think, days after he composed it, do you see him kicking back and being like, this is going to be huge one day?
Well, it did kind of go viral. It was printed several days later. The poem was printed in the Baltimore newspaper, and newspapers up and down the East Coast started copying it because they thought that the words represented the event very well. And so I talk about this in the book, kind of track the spread of where it's going, where it's being printed in different newspapers. So, and then it was first sung to the tune, I think in October. So that's very quickly after the poem was published. And so I guess the answer I would say is no, he probably had no idea. He didn't even know, he wouldn't know the United States would be what it is, 200 years from when he was living. So I think he'd probably be shocked that you can go to his grave and press a button and hear a recording of the Star-Spangled Banner.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. Thank you so much, Tim, for that presentation and for joining us for this virtual lecture series. What's the most convenient way for people to find your books?
Anywhere they're sold. They're usually sold, whatever your favorite bookseller is.
Okay, so if you're interested in those, go search those out and support Tim. And I want to thank everybody for joining us for this virtual lecture series. And thanks again to the Maryland Humanities Council. And if you guys want to help us continue to do programming like this, please head to our website, pride2.org. And there's a donate button. There's also a merch store if you want to buy some t-shirts, some hats, some stickers, some coasters. So please check those out. And once again, our next lecture series is going to be March 3rd, and I hope to see you guys there. Take care, everyone.